Good day, my name is Billy Bataille. Today, we will be talking about specialization and trade. When two individuals or when two nations have to complete two tasks, they can either decide to produce it on their own or they can decide to cooperate. Because each individual and each nation has different strengths and weaknesses, it would make sense for these individuals or these nations to cooperate. If they do so, they'll be able to produce more, they'll be able to produce faster, or they will be able to produce using less resources. We can represent by a small block the production of each individual or of each nation if they decide to produce independently. But if we want to represent the size of the total combined production of two individuals or of two nations that decide to cooperate, we can represent their production by a block that's going to be even bigger. This happens because each individual and each nation specializes in what they are better at doing. In that way, they can produce more by combining their efforts. This is the simple logic behind specialization and trade. Let's look at the concept of specialization a little closer. Before we can establish trading, we must decide which task will be accomplished by which individual and which nation. We must determine the task in which each individual and each nation will specialize. To do this, we must learn of two economic concepts: the concept of absolute advantage and the concept of comparative advantage. The concept of absolute advantage is the easiest of the two concepts. Having an absolute advantage means that you are simply better at producing a good. This can happen because an individual can produce a good faster, or this can happen because a nation can produce a good with less resources or with less money. And so, an individual or a nation could have an absolute advantage in two tasks. The concept of comparative advantage is a little bit more complex. Having a comparative advantage means that you are better at accomplishing one task relative to the other task. This means that you must determine which of the two tasks you are much better at accomplishing relative to the other task. The task in which you're the best at accomplishing is the task in which you will have a comparative advantage. Now, what's important is you can never have two comparative advantages. Hence, the task in which you are the best is the task in which you or the nation have a comparative advantage, and then the other individual or the other nation will have a comparative advantage in the other task. Let's take a practical example of the concept of specialization and trade. Let's assume there is a couple, John and Shane, or there are two nations, the US and China. Each of them will have to decide in which area they will specialize. John and Cheng have two tasks to accomplish, and they must decide which of the two tasks will each of them do. The US and China must decide which of the countries will produce which good. Let's take a closer look at the table. It has numbers that are in an undefined unit, but that's not going to be a problem. John and Cheng must decide who of the two will cook and who of the two will work to earn money. The US and China must decide who of the two will produce food or agricultural goods, and who of the two will produce iPhones or manufacturing goods. John or the US can produce 60 units of cooking or food, but Cheng or China can produce 80 units of food. Hence, Cheng or China have an absolute advantage in the production of food. If we look at the production of work or iPhone, John and the US can produce 4 units. Again, Cheng and China can produce 24 units of work or 24 iPhones. And so we have that once again, Cheng and China have an absolute advantage in the production of work or in the production of iPhones. But we must still determine who of the two has the comparative advantage to determine which of the two will specialize in the production of which of the two goods. What we can see is that Cheng and China are better at producing food than John or the United States. But they are even better, relatively, at producing iPhones or manufacturing goods. Hence, Cheng or China will have a comparative advantage in the production of work or of iPhones. And we learned that you can only have one comparative advantage. This means that John or the United States will have the comparative advantage in the production of food. Cheng and China will specialize in producing iPhones and manufacturing goods, and the US or John will specialize in the production of food. We will now look at a second table to help us to understand our example a little better. We can see in section 1 that we make an assumption. We assume that John, the United States, Cheng, or China will spend a quarter of their time producing food and 3/4 of their time producing iPhones. This assumption is actually realistic, but our proof would have worked even had these numbers been slightly different. What is important here is that we establish a certain maximum amount that John, the United States, China, or Cheng can produce if they do not trade. This table tells us that if John and the United States spend 1/4 of their time producing food, they will produce 15 units of food. And since they have 3/4 of their time remaining, they can use it to produce iPhones, and they would produce 3 iPhones. Cheng and China can produce 20 units of food with 1/4 of their time. And with the remaining 3/4, they can produce 18 iPhones. The calculations for this can be verified, but they're really easy to compute. Now, let's look at section 2. This section describes the state of the world where John, the United States, Cheng, China specialize in the production of the good in which they are the best, which means they specialize in producing the good in which they have a comparative advantage. Again, from the numbers that we had from the previous table, we can calculate that John, if he would specialize and spend all of his time producing food, or if the United States would specialize and they would spend all of their resources producing food, well, they would be able to produce 60 units. If Cheng or China would then specialize in the production of iPhones, they would be able to produce 24 units. We can now move to section 3, where the terms of the trade, or the relative price of food in terms of iPhone, has been established. In section 3, you can see that after having produced 60 units of food, John or the United States sell 35 of them to Cheng or to China, which of course buy these 35 units. In exchange, John or the United States buy 4 iPhones from Cheng or from China, who of course sell them for iPhones. And so, if we go to section 4, we look at what John and the United States have produced now that they have specialized. We add and subtract what they have traded for, and we find that at the end, John has 25 units of food, which is the 60 units that John or the United States produced, minus the 35 that they sold to Cheng or to China. And then John, who did not produce any iPhone, but bought 4 iPhones from Cheng and China, now has 4 iPhones. If we look at the other column, if we look at Cheng and China, what we see is that they never produced any food when they specialized, but they bought 35 units of food from John and the United States, hence they now have 35 units of food to consume. They were able to produce 24 iPhones when they specialized, and they sold 4 iPhones to John or to the United States, hence they have 20 iPhones left. And so section 5 summarizes the gains of trade that each of the two made. John has 10 more units of food if he specializes in trade than he would have had he decided not to specialize and not to trade. And he also has 1 more iPhone. And so John wins both in the production of food and in the production of iPhone. Cheng and China have 15 units more of food than if they had not decided to specialize and trade, because they now have 35 units as opposed to the 20 units they would have had. Not only that, but they have 2 iPhones more than if they had decided not to specialize and not to trade. Hence, this is one example that clearly shows that specialization and trade makes both parties better off. Now we can see from that table that the gains of trade, what each of the two parties won, is not necessarily equal. This has to do with the terms of trade, or it has to do with the price of the goods that John, the US, Cheng, or China, buys and sells. And so, when we have trade, it does not necessarily mean that both parties win the same amount. What has to be negotiated is the price so that trade can be more fair and can be more beneficial to both parties. But this would be what we would study in another lesson. Thank you for having listened to my lecture. This was Billy Bataille. Goodbye.